They pulled her from the boarding line like she was a threat. No explanation, no apology, just a cold command and a look that said you don't belong here. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She handed over her ticket again, showed her ID again, and still they surrounded her like she was lying. Like a black girl in first class was some kind of glitch in the system. By now, other passengers were staring. Some were whispering. One of them even filmed it. But no one stepped in. Not one person said, "She's done nothing wrong." Not one. What they didn't know, what even she didn't know in that moment, was that this was no ordinary passenger. And this was not going to end the way they thought. This story doesn't begin with calm. It starts here, in the middle of a storm, where a teenage girl is dragged from her rightful seat and nobody, not even the man in uniform, realizes just how badly they've misjudged her. Because the moment they chose to turn her into a target, they set something bigger in motion. And when the truth comes out, it won't just change airport policy, it'll shake the system that let this happen in the first place. This is not just a story about a flight, not just about a seat. This is about what happens when power is abused in plain sight, and the victim isn't who you think she is. This is about race, about arrogance, about what it means to be seen as a threat for simply existing in the wrong place, wearing the wrong clothes at the wrong time. But here's the twist. She wasn't in the wrong place. And this time, she's not walking away quietly. So don't scroll. Don't blink. Because the people who tried to silence her are about to learn what happens when the story they tried to bury goes public. If you're watching this and it hits you, if you've ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated, hit that like button. Subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? What part of this hits hardest? Let's talk about it. Let's keep the pressure on. Because the fight doesn't end when the video goes viral. It starts there. Washington Dulles International buzzed with early morning fatigue and impatient footsteps, the kind of energy that clung to your clothes like humidity and tension mixed. It was 6:04 a.m., and the airport hadn't yet reached full throttle, but the lines at security already curled like vines. Neon signs blinked overhead, while automated announcements echoed off glass and concrete, instructing passengers to remove laptops, liquids, shoes, dignity. Nyla Kincaid adjusted the strap on her crossbody bag and stepped forward, a 17-year-old black girl in a slate gray hoodie, fitted jeans, and clean white Jordans that hadn't seen a scuff since she bought them 3 weeks ago. Her travel was purposeful. First class to Chicago on an early flight, en route to visit the university that had just offered her a full academic scholarship. One of the top 5 STEM programs in the country. She should have been thinking about dorm tours and degree tracks. Instead, her instincts were twitching. Her hands clutched the boarding pass and passport tightly. Something about this checkpoint, this moment, this air, it wasn't right. When she stepped up to the TSA lane, the officer there didn't even try to hide it. Maddox. Brent Maddox, according to his nameplate. Square-jawed, early 40s, crew cut. His eyes swept over Nyla the way someone inspected a stain they weren't sure how to clean. "Step to the right, miss," he said, motioning her out of the general lane into a side section. Random check. His tone was flat, but his smirk wasn't. Nyla didn't flinch. She moved as instructed, setting her bag on the conveyor belt, removing her shoes and hoodie, revealing a fitted black tank top beneath. She stood on the scanner's footprints, raised her arms. The machine swirled around her body like a digital exhale. She waited. Maddox didn't. "I'm going to need you to step aside," he said, waving her over before the screen even finished loading. A female agent joined him. White, mid-30s, platinum bob under the TSA cap. "We need to check your hair," she said bluntly, holding up blue gloves. "Why?" Nyla asked, voice calm but firm. "You saw the scan. There's nothing in my hair." The woman frowned. "It's procedure. Could be foreign material. You'll need to remove it." "Remove it?" "The extensions. Or wig, or whatever it is." Maddox chuckled. "We've had some creative smugglers," he said, loud enough for the line to hear. "You'd be surprised what folks try to sneak through their weave." The comment landed like a slap, just subtle enough to avoid reprimand. just loud enough to trigger laughter behind her. A teen boy 3 spots back snickered. Someone muttered, "She probably never flew before." Nyla's fingers twitched, her jaw tight. She didn't argue. She simply parted her braids and tugged gently at the roots, showing her scalp. "It's my real hair," she said. "Braided extensions. Check the scan. There's nothing there." The woman leaned closer, peering like Nyla was a specimen. "Still need to verify," she mumbled, then patted Nyla's head as if she were a dog. Nyla didn't move. She just stared straight ahead, blinking slow. "Done?" she asked. The woman nodded. Nyla stepped toward the end of the conveyor, grabbing her shoes. But before she could collect her bag, Maddox intercepted. "Hold up," he said. "We've got a flag on this one." He yanked the bag off the belt and placed it on the table, unzipping it slowly, theatrically. "You traveling alone?" he asked. "Yes," Nyla replied. "To Chicago. Everything's on my ticket." Maddox opened her toiletry pouch. Inside were travel-sized items: lip balm, small sunscreen, toothbrush, satin bonnet, and a tinted glass bottle labeled argan and peppermint oil. He picked it up like it was ticking. "What's this?" he asked. "Hair oil," Nyla answered, her voice tightening. "It's allowed. Under 3 ounces." Maddox twisted the cap, sniffed. "Smells sharp," he said, grimacing. "Almost medicinal." He looked at the female agent. "Could be masking agents." The agent shrugged. "Could be," she echoed, though her face said she didn't believe it. Nyla folded her arms. "Do you check every teenage girl's hair oil, or just mine?" Maddox leaned in, his smile crooked. "Depends. Most don't walk in like they own the place." "Or like they paid for first class?" she asked. Maddox's smirk faded for a beat. "Watch the attitude," he said. "It's not going to help." Behind them, the line had grown. Impatience churned. More murmurs. Someone groaned. Nyla's phone buzzed in her hoodie pocket on the table. She glanced down. "A text from Dad. Boarding now. Let me know when you clear security." She typed back with one hand as Maddox slowly zippered the bag shut. "Still here. We'll call soon." "You can go," he finally said, handing her the bag with one hand and her passport with the other. This time, she slipped on her hoodie again. "There won't be a next time." Maddox chuckled. "We'll see about that." She walked away from the checkpoint without looking back, even as she heard him mutter to the woman next to him. "Bet she thinks she's famous or something." Would explain the attitude. "Probably TikTok," the woman said. They both laughed. But Nyla kept moving. She didn't stumble, didn't cry, didn't break pace. Because if there's one thing life had taught her by 17, it was this. In rooms you're not expected to walk into, you don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you shrink. She reached gate C14 in 5 minutes flat. Her hands still shook, barely, but she shoved them in her hoodie and stood in line like any other passenger. And when her boarding group was called, she stepped forward. First-class ticket scanned, passport matched. The gate agent barely glanced at her. "Have a good flight," he said. But the damage had already begun. She boarded with her chin up, silent, seething. And somewhere, far above the clouds she hadn't even reached yet, the first fault line had cracked. Nyla hadn't said a word since leaving the TSA checkpoint. Her jaw ached from clenching, and her fingers kept tightening around the handle of her rolling carry-on, like each step toward the boarding area pulled tension further into her bones. She moved past the food court, past the duty-free shops, past the announcements echoing from unseen speakers. C14 was visible now, but the large LCD screens were glitching, flickering back and forth between on time and a blank blue. She paused near a gate desk where a middle-aged male staffer in a pressed blue vest sat chewing gum behind the counter, tapping at a monitor like it had personally offended him. "Excuse me," Nyla said, her voice steady but low. "Can you confirm if Flight 1281 is still boarding from C14? The man didn't look up. His eyes remained on the screen, fingers still tapping. "Check the board," he muttered, voice flat. "I did. It's glitching." He let out a long sigh, still not looking at her, and jabbed his thumb toward the flickering display overhead. "Still the board," he said. "That's what we use." A white woman approached behind Nyla, older, wielding a matching Louis Vuitton set, sunglasses still on indoors. Before Nyla could try again, the man's head lifted, and he beamed. "Hey there, ma'am. Flying first today." The woman smiled, nodding. "Lax. You're golden," he grinned. "Right this way, that line there." Nyla stepped back, lips parted, eyebrows raised. She said nothing. She didn't have to. The man never glanced back at her, not once. She turned away, heartbeat rising again, not from panic now, but from the cold certainty that this wasn't random. This was method. This was institutionalized. And it wasn't done with her yet. She followed the signs toward the premium lounge, trying to recenter her focus. Inside, the space was a picture of corporate serenity. Low lights, deep leather chairs, hushed conversations, and espresso machines hissing in the background. She stepped up to the podium and handed over her boarding pass. The woman at the counter, a brunette in her 20s with a shell-pink blazer and a badge that read Gina, took it, scanned it, and nodded. "First class, yes. Welcome in." Nyla exhaled slowly and walked inside, choosing a chair in the corner near the window. The lounge overlooked the runways, long stretches of concrete glinting in the morning sun. For a few seconds, she just sat, letting the silence wash over her. She took out her phone and texted her father again. Through security. It was ugly. "We'll explain later." A moment later, the door behind her opened with a hiss, and in walked Officer Brent Maddox, scanning the room like it owed him something. His sunglasses were now perched atop his head, his walk slow, purposeful. He stopped when he saw her. "Hey," he said, voice too loud for the space. Conversations halted. Heads turned. "This lounge is for premium passengers." Nyla looked up from her phone. "I know. I'm a premium passenger." Maddox smirked. "Really?" He stepped closer. "Got the wrong badge then. You sure you didn't mean the main terminal?" She opened her wallet and pulled out the pass again. "Boarding, Group 1. Seat 1C. First class. Want to read it yourself." Gina, still at the desk, had stood up now, eyes wide. Maddox glanced at the pass in her hand, but didn't reach for it. He just stared a beat too long, then chuckled. "Guess they're handing those out in cereal boxes now." That got a few stiff laughs from nearby seats. A businessman sipped his latte without looking up. A woman in a pantsuit shook her head, but stayed silent. Nyla stood slowly. Her voice didn't rise, but her words cut clean. "This is the second time today you've made me justify my presence. First at security. Now here. What exactly is your issue?" Maddox stepped back half an inch, as if surprised she spoke. "No issue," he said, suddenly casual. "Just doing my job. Keeping things orderly." "Is that why you ignored protocol and singled me out?" she asked. "Because if there's a written policy somewhere that says I can't be here, I'd love to see it." Gina finally stepped forward. "She's a first-class passenger, sir," she said quietly, but firm. "She's been verified." Maddox didn't look at her. He stared at Nyla another moment, his expression unreadable, then offered a tight nod. "Just checking." He turned and walked out, leaving behind a tension that didn't release. Nyla sat back down, but this time her fingers were trembling. Not from fear, from rage barely restrained. Her phone buzzed again. Her father had replied. "They give you trouble? Want me to make a call?" She stared at that message for a long time. No, not yet, but soon. She opened her camera app, took a silent photo of her boarding pass and seat assignment, and then another of the lounge pass. If she had to prove herself later, she'd be ready. Across the room, a man with silver hair leaned toward his companion and whispered something. They both glanced at her, then turned away. She knew that look. She'd seen it in school hallways, in bank lobbies, at job interviews. The silent assumption, you don't belong. Nyla stepped quietly toward the gate counter, the weight of the day hanging on her shoulders like something invisible but real. She tucked her phone back into her hoodie pocket, the yes she had just sent to her father still glowing faintly in her mind. She hadn't meant to escalate anything, not really. But now, as she approached the final check-in point, all she wanted was to have her seat confirmed and get on the plane. No more eyes, no more comments, no more proving herself. Just a smooth boarding and a quiet flight. Alan, the gate agent, didn't greet her when she stepped up. He barely looked at her as he took her ID and scanned her boarding pass. His fingers tapped lazily across the keyboard. For a brief second, she allowed herself to believe it might go smoothly. But then he paused, frowned, tilted his head at the screen. Nyla's heart gave a small, reluctant thump. She swallowed. "Is there something wrong?" she asked gently. Alan didn't answer right away. He glanced to his right, where, of course, Maddox was standing again, as if he had never left. Maddox stepped closer, casually, like a shadow that wouldn't go away. "Got another glitch?" he asked. "Maybe another one of those interesting upgrades?" Alan shrugged. "Systems showing first class, but the code's a little weird. It's legit, I think, but the format looks off." "Fake, maybe," Maddox said without hesitation. "Or somebody doctored the screenshot. Common scam, right? Seen a lot of that lately." "It's not fake," Nyla said, quiet but firm. "I've already been through TSA and the lounge. They scanned it. Everything checked out." Maddox leaned against the counter. "Sure, but sometimes these scams slip through a few checkpoints before they're flagged, especially if people get nervous about asking questions." That last part landed heavier than it needed to. Nyla felt her ears heat up. She looked at Alan, her lips parting to speak again, but someone behind her beat her to it. "I've seen that trick too," said a man's voice, older, low, coated with smug certainty. Nyla turned to see a white man in a long beige trench coat 2 places back in line. He was speaking to no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "They pull screenshots from Google, edit their name on it. I saw it once on a flight to Denver. Girl acted all innocent. Security had to come." Nyla's throat tightened. Maddox chuckled. "Yeah, I've seen that movie too," he said. "Always ends the same." Alan sighed, clearly uncomfortable now, but still scrolling on his screen. "Ma'am, do you have your confirmation email or receipt? Just to be thorough." Nyla nodded and pulled out her phone. Her hands weren't trembling, not exactly, but they felt clumsy as she unlocked the screen and searched her inbox. She found its subject line: "First class purchase confirmation, flight 1281. She turned the phone toward Alan. He took a glance. His expression softened just slightly. "Okay," he said, almost apologetic. "Yeah, it checks out. You're good." Nyla nodded slowly. She should have felt relieved. But instead, something small inside her had curled tighter. "Thanks," she said, barely above a whisper. Maddox gave a non-committal nod, then turned and walked off like it hadn't been anything at all. The man in the trench coat didn't apologize. He didn't look at her again. Alan handed back her documents. "You're all set," he said. "Group 1 will board soon." Nyla stepped away from the counter and walked to a nearby row of seats against the window. She didn't cry. She didn't make a scene. But she sat down slowly, the quiet of her breath the only thing she could hear clearly now. Her throat was dry, but not from fear. Just tired. Just worn. Her thoughts were a blur, not of anger, but of heaviness. Like something had settled on her chest, not crushing, just constant. She stared out at the runway, where planes were coming and going. And for a moment, she wondered what it might be like to walk through an airport and never have to explain yourself. Never have to be second-guessed. Never have to smile politely at people who assumed you didn't belong. Her phone buzzed softly. A text from her father again. "You okay? Want me to call the airline directly?" She didn't reply right away. Instead, she leaned her head against the cool glass, watching a plane taxi toward the gate. She wasn't angry, not in the loud kind of way, but she felt something ache in her chest, not just from what they said, but from how easy it was for them to say it, how confident they were in their doubt, how quickly strangers could line up behind an accusation just because of how she looked. Her father had always told her, "You don't fight every battle, but you don't forget them either." Maybe this was one of those times. Quietly, she pulled out her phone and took a screenshot of the confirmation email. Then another one of her scanned boarding pass. Then she saved them to a folder marked Dulles. When Group 1 was called, Nyla rose from her seat, slinging her backpack over one shoulder, pulling her small carry-on behind her. The line was short, mostly businessmen and quiet couples, some chatting, some scrolling phones. She joined them silently, letting the rhythm of movement lull her back into calm, or the closest thing she could manage. She had just reached the gate scanner when a sharp voice cut through the hum of travel noise. "Miss," Maddox said loudly, approaching from a side with that same smug, performative professionalism. "I need you to step out of the line for a secondary check." Conversations halted. A few passengers glanced over. Nyla blinked, confusion flashing first, then frustration. "You've already checked my documents," she said, her voice low, cautious. "You've seen my ID, my boarding pass, twice. And now we're doing a routine body scan," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Randomized protocol." She looked at the gate agent, who didn't meet her eyes. Maddox nodded toward a roped-off area beside the podium, then gestured for another female officer. "Let's move quickly, please. Don't hold up the line." Nyla stepped aside, throat tight. The whispers returned like an unwelcome draft. She could feel them, the questions, the silent judgments. She wasn't a girl anymore in this moment. She was a subject, a disruption, an image to be monitored. The female agent, who at least looked apologetic, waved a handheld scanner around her torso and back, then paused, glanced at the screen, and asked Nyla to hold still again. Another pass. Again, nothing. "Clear," the woman muttered. Nyla forced a breath through her nose. She walked back toward the line just as the final boarding call echoed through the speakers. As she approached the gate, Maddox stepped directly into her path. "One more thing," he said, tone almost casual now. "I placed a quick verification request to confirm your identity through our internal channel. Should just be a minute." "You what?" she asked, the weariness cracking in her voice. "You ran a background check?" "Just basic verification," he said with a shrug. "With all these fraudulent bookings lately, we're tightening things up. Happens all the time." "No," she replied, voice firmer now. "It doesn't happen all the time. It's happening to me, repeatedly." Maddox looked around theatrically, then leaned in slightly. "A lot of people pretend to be someone they're not. You'd be shocked." "Not really," she said, her eyes fixed on his. "I see it all the time too, people pretending they're better than they are." For a split second, his expression flickered. Then he smiled thinly and stepped aside. "After we get confirmation, you can board." Nyla stood there, her bag still in her hand, while the line dwindled to nothing. Only a few late arrivals remained now. The boarding door stood open but unmoving, like an invitation she hadn't quite earned. She glanced at the agent behind the podium, who looked uncomfortable, unsure whether to say anything or pretend she wasn't there. A small boy near the window pointed and asked his mom something. She didn't answer. Nyla's stomach twisted slowly, not from hunger or fear, but from the sinking feeling that this day, this relentless, grinding day, wasn't done trying to unravel her. Her phone buzzed again. "What's going on?" "They just flagged your ticket?" her dad texted. She hesitated before replying. "He's checking my identity now," she wrote. "He says it's routine." Then she added, "How much longer should I be quiet?" There was no answer yet, just the bubble of him typing, then stopping. Nyla looked up again. Maddox was pretending to scroll through his device, but she could feel his glance still watching her from the side, like she was a performance he was waiting to end. She glanced around, at the other passengers now seated inside the plane, at the attendants still waiting by the boarding door, at the clock that ticked closer to departure time. And for the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to feel small. Not defeated, not broken, but quiet in a way that felt heavier than usual. She wrapped her arms around herself, pressing her phone to her side. If someone had asked her in that moment what she was thinking, she wouldn't have known how to explain it. She didn't feel rage. Not anymore. She felt worn, like a page flipped too many times, like a name said wrong one too many mornings. She looked down at her sneakers, clean and white, and now dull under the overhead lighting, and thought, "I just want to go home." Just ahead, the last few passengers were scanning their tickets and walking down the jet bridge, and for a heartbeat, it looked like maybe, just maybe, this was over. But then the air shifted again, and the soft voice of a flight attendant sliced through the calm. "Miss Kincaid." Nyla turned. A woman in a Navy uniform, slim build, mid-30s, brunette hair pulled back tight, was walking toward her, polite smile in place, but eyes already tense. "Could I speak with you a moment?" Nyla felt her stomach clench again, a quiet reflex her body had learned too well today. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "We've just received a flag on your ticket," the woman said, voice carefully neutral. "We're going to ask you to step back from the boarding line for the time being." "Flag." Nyla repeated, the word catching on her tongue. It was just confirmed, again by the agent. "It's valid." "I understand," the woman said quickly. "We just need to double-check something. It won't take long." The gate agent didn't look up. Maddox, however, stood nearby, arms crossed, watching with the bored satisfaction of someone who'd set a trap and now waited for it to spring. Nyla hesitated. "You can check from here," she said quietly. "Why do I need to move?" "Protocol," the attendant replied. "Please." The word hung in the air like a warning. Nyla stepped back slowly, dragging her bag with her. Passengers in the terminal were starting to notice again. One woman nearby whispered something to her husband. A man a few rows back leaned forward. Nobody intervened. No one asked questions. Nyla's breath felt shallow, like she couldn't get it to settle in her chest. She didn't want to cry, God, not here, but her face was hot and her throat felt thick. Maddox stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "I've seen a lot of things over the years," he said, not to her, but toward the air. "But a first-class passenger in sweatpants, carrying a $50 backpack? That's new." He looked at her then, smile faint but smug. "You understand the confusion." Nyla's lips parted, but no sound came. She wanted to say something, to correct him, to point out how little her clothes had to do with her worth, but the words didn't come easily. Not after everything. She glanced down at her outfit. Navy hoodie, soft cotton joggers, clean sneakers. Comfortable, sure, but not sloppy, not disrespectful, not wrong. Just her. She looked up again and met Maddox's eyes. "You don't like the way I look," she said, quietly enough that only he and the attendant could hear. "So you've been trying to find a reason to take something from me since I walked through security." Maddox tilted his head slightly, amused. "That's a stretch." "Is it?" she asked. "Because I've done nothing wrong. And you keep pushing me further from my seat. From the gate. From dignity." The attendant shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Maddox exhaled through his nose. "You're being dramatic. This'll all be cleared in 5 minutes, if you just sit tight." Nyla stared at him, searching for any sign of decency. She didn't find it. "If I were wearing a blazer and heels," she said slowly, "would you have stopped me?" "Depends who's wearing them," he replied. Then, as if to underline the insult, he turned to the attendant and said, "Get her out of the way, please. I still have to secure this area." "Yes, sir," the woman said, then turned back to Nyla. "Please follow me." Nyla swallowed hard and nodded. She walked a few feet away to a small cluster of seats behind the check-in counter, just out of direct view of the boarding bridge. She sat down slowly, carefully, like her body might betray her and collapse if she moved too fast. She placed her bag at her feet, folded her hands in her lap, and stared at the patterned carpet without really seeing it. A few tears welled behind her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer strain of it all, the pressure of silence, the weight of injustice, the ache of being misjudged for the 5th time in one morning. The attendant who had pulled her aside stood a few feet away, pretending to scroll through her tablet, but glancing back every so often. Maddox was nowhere in view now, off to play authority elsewhere probably, leaving behind the silence that always followed men like him, the kind that said you're not worth another second of our time. And for the first time that day, Nyla didn't feel like proving anything. She was too tired. She just wanted the door to open and let her leave this place behind. But the moment that thought crossed her mind, a shift occurred. Small, quiet, but certain. At the far edge of the counter, a woman in a gray airport blazer had been tapping on a keyboard, entering boarding statuses and updating logs. She was young, early 30s maybe, with dark eyes and a sleek ponytail. Nyla hadn't paid her any attention. No one had. But now, the woman was frozen, her fingers suspended midair, eyes fixed on the name that had just popped up in her system. Nyla R. Kincaid. Age, 17. Flight 1281, Seat 1C, Government Clearance, Confidential Access, Code attached. Her mouth parted slightly. Her eyes flicked to Nyla, then back to the screen, then again to Nyla, this time slower, more focused. Recognition lit in her expression like a switch. She turned and whispered something into the headset at her shoulder, barely audible, but urgent. "This is Delaney at Gate C14. I need immediate contact with DHS Liaison Channel. Level 4 priority. Confirming ID of passenger linked to Avery Kincaid." Silence. Then a click. Confirmed. Proceed. Delaney stood up, her posture suddenly straighter. She typed a quick series of commands, triggering a silent notification through the airport's internal alert system. Across the terminal, in a small operations room where live camera feeds ran across a wall of monitors, a security coordinator received the ping. His eyes landed on the flashing icon. Code Violet Gate C14 unauthorized interference with DHS family tag. His hand reached for the red receiver on his desk. "We've got a problem," he said into the line. Repeat. Confirmed visual on Nyla Kincaid, DHS director's daughter. Targeted interference logged by on-site officer. Send the clip up the chain. Within 60 seconds, a video package was being compiled, security footage, gate transcripts, badge logs. Maddox's name was already flagged. The system cross-checked him against previous reports. Excessive force complaint in 2022, racial profiling note in 2021, disciplinary warning for conduct language. None of it enough to get him fired. Yet, but this was different. This wasn't just a passenger. This was Nyla Kincaid, and that name didn't move through systems quietly. At Gate C14, Delaney didn't explain any of this. She didn't run over and apologize or gasp or make a scene. She simply stepped toward the flight attendant who had moved Nyla and said in a clipped, low voice, "She needs to rejoin boarding. Now." The attendant blinked. "But she was flagged." "Override it," Delaney said. Immediately. The woman hesitated. "I was told to, and now I'm telling you," Delaney said sharply. "Return her to her position." Quietly. Then she walked past them both, straight to the boarding door, and pulled out her phone. As she dialed, her eyes remained on Nyla. Not with judgment, not with pity, but with purpose. Nyla, still seated, had noticed a change. Something was different in the way the attendant looked at her now, tense, almost deferential. The woman approached and said softly, "Miss Kincaid, would you come with me, please?" "What is it now?" Nyla asked, her voice dull, tired. "Am I being sent further back?" "No," the woman replied. "You're boarding now." Nyla stared for a second, confused. "I thought I was flagged." "It was cleared," she said. "Everything's been resolved." Nyla stood slowly, warily, gripping the handle of her carry-on. She walked back toward the gate, eyes scanning the area, expecting Maddox to appear again, to stop her again. But he didn't. He was gone. As she stepped past the scanner, the gate agent who had ignored her earlier finally looked up, face pale, words dry. "Enjoy your flight," he muttered. She didn't answer. She just walked forward. The jet bridge stretched before her, cold and narrow, but for the first time today, it didn't feel like a trap. It felt like progress. Behind her, Delaney spoke quietly into her phone. "Yes, sir. She's on board now. The team is already compiling the report. And Officer Maddox, he won't see it coming." Back in the terminal, just minutes after Nyla had boarded and disappeared into the narrow tunnel of the jet bridge, Officer Brent Maddox stood in a loose huddle near the checkpoint with two other uniformed guards, hands gesturing lazily as he relayed his version of events with visible pride. "Look," he said, smirking slightly. Maybe she wasn't screaming or throwing things like the usual ones, but trust me, it was in her eyes. She thought she could outsmart the system, fake her way into a seat that clearly wasn't hers. One of the guards raised an eyebrow. Didn't she have a first-class ticket, though? Maddox waved a dismissive hand. Sure, it scanned. But anyone with half a brain knows how easy that stuff is to fake these days. Screenshot. Barcode duplication. Even the paper looks real. She had the look too defensive, too confident for someone her age. either a seasoned manipulator or someone raised to think she could game the system without consequences. The other guard laughed under his breath, clearly entertained. "You think she'll try to pull something mid-flight?" "Nah," Maddox said, adjusting his belt, posture smug. "Now that we've put her on the radar, she'll probably stay quiet. Or she'll get flagged again when she lands. Either way, I did the right thing. It's about keeping standards in place." What Maddox didn't know, what none of them realized, was that just 20 feet away, sitting silently near a wall of charging stations, a college student named Eli Moreno had recorded almost the entire incident. From the moment Maddox pulled Nyla out of line, to the unnecessary body scan, to the final remark about her backpack and appearance, it was all there, captured on 4K resolution with audio clear as glass. Eli hadn't said anything at the time. He hadn't stood up or challenged authority. But he'd seen enough. And now, sitting cross-legged on the floor with his laptop open and AirPods in, Eli was editing, cutting, splicing, overlaying captions. He wasn't a stranger to this kind of content. He ran a small but growing TikTok account where he posted social commentary, quiet injustices caught on camera, moments people might otherwise miss. But this wasn't small. This was different. The girl hadn't yelled. She hadn't resisted. She had followed every rule, answered every question, showed every document, and still, she was treated like a threat. Eli added a caption in white bold font at the top. She had a valid ticket. She followed every rule. They still tried to stop her. He added another at the bottom. This is what casual racism looks like. A final edit flashed the hashtag #SheBelongs. He uploaded the clip at 9:42 a.m. At 9:57, it hit 20,000 views. By 10:20, it passed 1 million. The comments came in fast and furious. Why is she being searched again? She didn't do anything. The officer's tone is disgusting. Tag the airport. Tag the airline. Make this go viral. Influencers with massive followings started sharing the post, adding their own commentary. Civil rights accounts amplified it. Activists reposted it on Twitter, Instagram, even Reddit. The image of Nyla standing silently, backpack in hand, while being ordered around by Maddox, played on a loop across phones and screens in airports and cafes all over the country. Meanwhile, Maddox was still laughing, oblivious. "She'll think twice before trying that again," he said, taking a sip from a paper coffee cup. "Sometimes these kids need to be reminded that rules still matter." Behind him, a younger TSA trainee was checking his phone, expression tightening. He recognized the video. It was already trending on his For You page. He didn't say anything. Not yet. But he watched Maddox for a long time before returning to his post. Inside the plane, Nyla sat by the window in seat 1C, headphones in, but no music playing. She stared at the runway as the aircraft began its slow crawl toward takeoff. She still didn't know what had changed, who had called what number, or why the mood had shifted so suddenly. But something had. And though she hadn't expected justice, something in her chest dared to hope, not for an apology, but for acknowledgement. The captain's voice crackled overhead, welcoming passengers. Nyla closed her eyes, letting the vibration of the engines fill the space that words couldn't reach. CNN's headline read, "Teen harassed at Dulles, but she's no ordinary passenger." Underneath was a photo of Nyla at the security gate, eyes wide and confused, caught mid-scan. It didn't take long for investigative teams to do what Maddox hadn't, look closer. Cross-referencing the name on the boarding pass with federal travel registries, it became clear who Nyla was, not just a black teen flying first class, not just a face in a viral clip, but the daughter of Avery Kincaid, the sitting director of Homeland Security. And suddenly, the story wasn't just about profiling. It was about federal violation, about how a teenager with national security protections had been targeted in public view by an airport officer more concerned with enforcing his biases than honoring her rights. In Washington, D.C., the response was immediate. Avery Kincaid was in a closed-door meeting when an aide passed him a tablet with a live headline. He didn't blink. He read every word, watched the video in silence, then stood without excuse and made a call. 20 minutes later, a government-issued Gulfstream lifted off the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base. headed straight for Dulles. On board, Avery's expression remained calm but unreadable, the tight kind of calm reserved for men who had learned to control storms rather than speak of them. Back at the airport, Maddox had just started to realize something was wrong. The folded paper handed to him earlier had contained a simple directive from the internal DHS liaison: cease all passenger contact. Await further instruction. Do not speak to press. But by now, press had arrived. Cameramen with credentials were setting up outside the security terminal. Reporters were calling airport media lines every 5 minutes. A line of black SUVs had pulled up along the private access road, unmarked but unmistakable. Inside the terminal, chatter had grown tense. TSA supervisors whispered near monitors. Airport operations staff scrolled anxiously through trending posts. Someone had placed Maddox on administrative hold. He hadn't even processed the weight of it yet. He thought it was a misunderstanding. He thought maybe this was overblown, that they'd walk it back. But then Avery Kincaid walked through the security doors, flanked by federal security detail, and the room stopped breathing. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a black pullover and slate gray slacks, but the air around him carried the same authority as a presidential seal. His presence didn't shout. It didn't need to. The silence that followed him said more than any raised voice could. He didn't pause as he approached the TSA office suite, passing Maddox without even turning his head. Reporters swarmed outside the glass, cameras flashing. Kincaid stopped only once, just before disappearing behind the restricted door. He turned back to the crowd and spoke just loud enough for the microphones to catch. "We trust these officers to protect our people," he said. "Not to humiliate them, not to profile them, and certainly not to target my daughter or anyone else who looks like her. Let me be clear, this isn't about who she is. It's about what was done. And we will not allow people like Officer Maddox to continue deciding who deserves dignity." Then he disappeared inside. Maddox stood frozen, caught between disbelief and dread. The guards he had joked with earlier avoided his eye now. One of them slowly walked away. In the minutes that followed, 2 men in black suits entered the staff zone with clipped steps and neutral faces. One of them called Maddox's name. "You need to come with us." "Why?" he asked, his voice smaller than he expected. "For review," the man said. "Internal inquiry immediate." "You can't." "We can," the other agent said, holding up a badge that bore the DHS insignia. "Now." Maddox turned, his posture stiffer than before, walking slowly behind them down the corridor. The viral clip still looped on screens in the lounge. The comments still surged, each one sharper than the last. She didn't flinch. She didn't run. She stood still while they tore her down. The daughter of Homeland Security got profiled. Imagine what happens to the rest of us. Accountability doesn't stop at apology. Fire him. The hearing room in the Capitol was silent except for the occasional shuffle of paper or the quiet tap of a pen against a tablet. Rows of chairs stretched across the back, filled with press, observers, and public officials, while the long bench of congressional committee members faced the center platform where Nyla now sat, upright in a navy blazer, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The seal of the United States glinted behind her head, and the weight of its symbolism felt heavy in the stillness. She'd been flown in from Chicago under official escort, briefed by legal aides, prepped by federal liaisons, but nothing had prepared her for the moment when they turned on the microphone and asked her to tell the country what had happened. She leaned forward slightly, voice soft but audible, not shaky. "My name is Nyla Kincaid. I'm 17 years old. And on April 12th, I was pulled aside 5 separate times while attempting to board a flight I paid for, with a valid first-class ticket. I was searched, questioned, flagged, and delayed, all without cause. I complied with every request. I showed every document. I answered every question. And none of it mattered, because someone had already decided I didn't belong in that seat. There was no sound in the room, no shuffling, no coughs, no chair creaks. Just the quiet, echoing strength of a teenager who should have been worrying about school, not systemic bias. One of the committee members, a senator from Oregon, leaned forward. "Miss Kincaid, do you believe the officer in question targeted you because of your race?" Nyla nodded. "Yes," she said, "I do. And I believe he thought he could do it, because people who look like me don't usually have anyone powerful enough to stop it. I wasn't flagged because of a system error. I was flagged because he couldn't imagine someone like me sitting in first class without doing something wrong." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was the steady tone of someone who had spent hours thinking through every word. "If my father wasn't who he is," she continued, "I wouldn't be sitting here right now. I'd be another girl with a story no one believes." The panel chair, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a firm mouth, nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Miss Kincaid. That was very clear." Next came the footage, compiled from airport security, passenger phones, and internal staff logs. The screen flickered to life with moments everyone in the room had seen online, but were now forced to watch in full. The body scan, the false flag, Maddox's words. "Bet she thinks she's important. Probably TikTok famous. Just another scammer trying to sit with the big dogs." Gasps rippled through the audience. Some lawmakers looked away. Others shook their heads. But the damage was undeniable. Then came the witnesses. Eli Moreno, the college student who had posted the original video, stepped up with a composed demeanor and detailed recollection. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't resist. Everything she did was quiet, controlled. "I filmed it because I knew no one would believe her if I didn't." A flight attendant from the terminal spoke next, Suri Klein, who had been working at a nearby gate and watched everything unfold. "We all saw it happen," she admitted. "We talk about these things off the record all the time, who gets pulled more, who gets treated differently. But I've never seen it escalate like that. It wasn't just unprofessional. It was personal." But the most surprising turn came not from the room, but from what happened after Nyla's story went public. Within days, over 40 former passengers submitted statements to an independent civil rights panel. They described similar patterns: being pulled for extra screening, being accused of forging tickets, being talked down to or removed from lines by Officer Brent Maddox. Some were students. Some were elderly. Most were people of color. And none had spoken out before. But now, with Nyla's story everywhere, they found the courage. A civil rights law firm compiled the testimonies into a formal class action. Names long forgotten were typed out again with dates and flight numbers, affidavits, and emotional accounts. The scale of it shifted everything. This was no longer a single incident. It was a pattern, a system of unchecked behavior enabled by silence and fear. The panel reviewed each case alongside the DHS internal report, which cited Maddox's prior infractions, the warnings buried in HR files, the bias complaints that never reached formal investigation. And with every new line of evidence, the case grew darker. By the end of the week, Maddox had been officially terminated and placed under federal review for abuse of authority. His badge was revoked, his pension frozen pending outcome. And he wasn't the only one. 2 supervisors who had ignored earlier complaints were reassigned. The airport security vendor was placed under contract probation. And a subcommittee drafted a new proposal that would require mandatory bias training, independent oversight at transportation hubs, and real-time reporting systems accessible to passengers in all major airports. But in the hearing room, none of that mattered to Nyla in the moment. What mattered was that people were listening. Not just nodding, not just tweeting, but finally listening. She glanced across the room at her father, who sat quietly in the second row, hands folded, face unreadable. He hadn't spoken to the press. He hadn't needed to. His presence was statement enough. The sky over Washington was soft and gray the morning Brent Maddox walked up the courthouse steps in a navy suit that didn't quite fit him the way his uniform used to. Gone was the badge clipped to his belt, gone was the swagger in his step, and gone, perhaps most importantly, was the certainty that the world would always tilt in his favor. The cameras didn't flash for him, not like they had for Nyla, but they were there, trained steadily on his face as he kept his head low and said nothing. He wasn't handcuffed, not yet, but the indictment papers carried by the federal agents beside him told the story loud enough. 3 charges: civil rights violation under color of law, obstruction of a federal security process, and retaliatory profiling. And that wasn't even counting the class action pending in civil court, now signed by 53 former passengers and counting. Inside the building, his former department had already cut ties. His DHS security clearance was revoked. His airport certifications invalidated. His pension frozen indefinitely. There would be no quiet resignation, no reassignment, no soft landing. This time, the system he once used as a shield was turning inward, and it had his name in bold. Across town, in a conference hall packed with reporters and government officials, a podium stood at the center of a raised stage. Behind it, a blue backdrop bore the seal of the Department of Homeland Security. Avery Kincaid stood alone, no aides at his side, no teleprompter. Just a small stack of notes, and the kind of quiet composure that carried more weight than outrage ever could. The room fell still as he began. "Last month," he said, "my daughter was pulled from a boarding line. Not because she posed a threat, not because she triggered a system warning, but because someone saw her and decided she didn't fit their idea of who belongs." His voice was even, but his eyes were hard. "Let me be clear. This is not about her identity. This is about what was done to her, and what has been done over and over to countless people in this country who didn't have the benefit of a last name someone recognized." The room remained silent. Brent Maddox was not just one man with poor judgment. He was a symptom of a larger disease: unchecked bias dressed as procedure, arrogance dressed as authority. He paused, letting the words settle. We cannot continue to allow gatekeepers who don't understand the weight of a gate. A ripple of acknowledgement moved through the crowd. Avery adjusted the microphone slightly. "Some have asked me if this is justice, if seeing him charged, seeing policies changed, if that's enough. And I'll tell you what I told my daughter. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. Justice is quiet. Justice is slow. Justice is when silence breaks, and the truth is allowed to stand without interruption." Then his gaze swept the room. My daughter didn't scream. She didn't fight. She didn't need to, because the system counted on her silence, and she denied it that comfort. The statement was brief, but the message was seismic. In the days that followed, airports across the country issued internal memos mandating revised training protocols. TSA released a new standard for implicit bias screening. The FAA partnered with civil rights watchdogs to establish a review board for misconduct claims. And Nyla, who had quietly returned to her studies, received messages from strangers around the world, students, parents, even former airport employees, thanking her for holding her ground. She never responded to most of them, not because she didn't care, but because she was still processing how a moment of unwanted attention had become a national flashpoint. She still took the train to school sometimes. She still wore her hoodie. She still sat in window seats with her headphones on, looking out, silent. But something had changed. Not in how she moved through the world, but in how the world now had to move around her. The next time she flew, it was to New York for a student symposium. No one stopped her at security. No one questioned her ID. No one called her out of line. They scanned her ticket, smiled, and said, "Have a good flight." And she did. And later that night, after the symposium ended, she sat in her hotel room, pulled out her notebook, and wrote one line across the first page. "I didn't want to be a symbol. I just wanted to sit down." But sometimes, she had learned, sitting down could be the most powerful act of all. The end. If this story resonated with you, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with others who believe in justice and accountability. Which moment stood out to you the most? Was it Nyla's quiet strength, the viral video that changed everything, or the final reckoning Maddox never saw coming? Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what part of the story struck you the deepest? We're listening.